There are a lot of canine-esque Pokemon out there, like the Growlithe line, the Rockruff line, and even our very own Booster, who is a Houndoom. These Pokemon are some of, if not the most popular kinds of Pokemon out there, as they often make great household Pokemon for people in all kinds of situations. Families with kids, living in an apartment in the city, whether you're home all the time or gone most of the day for work, there really is a canine out there for almost any situation. But that's not to say that they're all equally easy to care for. Some are way easier to house than others. Take Booster for example. Houndour and Houndoom aren't often kept as family pets due to their usually stubborn and territorial nature. It can lead to problems when it comes to small children. But in that same situation, a Lillipup could be the perfect Pokemon with small kids. But for me, living on the sort of ranch that I do, I think Booster is the perfect dog for me, as he's very protective of the Pokemon that I raise. All that to say that while canines are very popular, you need to match the Pokemon to the situation. And that brings us to Vulpix. Welcome everyone to the Pokemon Care Guides, where we talk about different Pokemon species and how you would raise them in your own home. Today, we'll be talking about the fiery fox Pokemon Vulpix and its evolution Ninetales. Vulpix is a small, red, canine Pokemon with small red curls of fur on its head and 9 red curling tails. Though, when they're first born, they only have one white tail, which then splits and changes color as the Pokemon ages. It's not a terribly big Pokemon either, only measuring an average of 2 feet tall and 20 pounds. However, when exposed to a Firestone, Vulpix will evolve into Ninetales, a majestic, golden-colored fox that stands almost 4 feet tall and weighs about 45 pounds. Ninetales obviously keeps the 9 tails from its previous form, but now they have the shiny golden color of the rest of the Pokemon, and the tails no longer curl. Instead, they're long and flowing, like a golden mane spreading out behind this Pokemon. But should you get a Ninetales, don't grab those tails unless you have a very good bond with this Pokemon. They do not like their tails being touched. But we can talk all about that later on in the guide. For now, let's get into the guide and figure out if this Pokemon line is the perfect Pokemon partner for you. Enclosure. Because Vulpix is another stone evolution, I'm going to be giving you enclosure sizes for both Vulpix and Ninetales. This way, if you don't want to evolve your Vulpix into a Ninetales, you don't have to spend the extra money and can save on the space that you need. Another thing, I'm sure that there will be people out there that mention how they've seen videos online of people keeping fox Pokemon like Vulpix and Nickit in their house. While yes, you can do this, it's really only an option as long as they haven't reached maturity yet. After they do, then they start to mark their territory and can get really territorial towards you and other Pokemon. So to keep your Pokemon from running wild and ruining your walls and furniture, it's best to keep them outside. The walls of the enclosure are to be made of chain link fencing. That way there will still be a good airflow through the enclosure. Be sure to get the chain link that has been treated to be heat resistant, as your fire Pokemon could just melt their way through the regular stuff if they wanted to. Using this fencing, you'll be making an enclosure that is 6 feet tall, 8 feet wide, and 13 feet in length, providing plenty of room for your Vulpix to move around and run. Luckily, the enclosure doesn't get that much bigger when, and if, you decide to evolve your Pokemon. You can keep the enclosure at 6 feet tall, but you should expand the width and length to 12 feet and 18 feet respectively. Vulpix, and to a lesser extent Ninetales, are both subject to the all too familiar phenomenon of the zoomies, and will go through spurts of activity, so the area of the enclosure will provide them somewhere to spend some of that energy. But their enclosures won't just be the 4 chain link fences. These Pokemon are very good escape artists, so you will need to add a ceiling to the enclosure as well. The easiest way to do a ceiling would be to just add a chain link ceiling, but if you do want to do something like a wooden roof or something else, then there shouldn't be a problem with that. And in the same vein, you'll also need to put in dig guards. In the wild, these Pokemon dig dens, pretty big ones, where they would live and raise their young. So to prevent the escape of your Pokemon through a newly dug tunnel, you'll need to do something to prevent that. One of the easiest ways would be to set the chain link fence into the ground, forming a barrier that will stop them from digging out under the fence. At one end of the enclosure, be sure to install a door that you can use to enter the enclosure. That way you can clean it and play with your Pokemon. You'll just need to make sure that it's secure and your Pokemon has no way of being able to open it on its own. Finally, at the opposite end of the enclosure from where you put the door, you should install a Pokemon house that is large enough to allow your Pokemon to be able to stretch out and relax. I say install because you should have the body of the Pokemon house be outside the enclosure itself, and then have the entrance of the Pokemon house attached to the fencing. That way, your Pokemon has the entirety of the enclosure space to explore without the Pokemon house taking up a significant portion of it. As for the inside of the enclosure, the ground can be multiple different things. This can range from building a wooden floor to cover the ground, filling the ground with gravel, covering the layer of fencing with just more dirt and having actual grass, or installing turf on the ground. Out of all of them, I would recommend building the deck, as it's the least likely for your Pokemon to dig through and can be very easy to clean. Just scoop and hose it down. Grass and gravel aren't a bad idea, but just understand that the Pokemon will dig through it, so you should keep stockpiles of spare gravel or dirt, as you'll be filling in holes a lot of the time. Turf, it can work, as it will be very resistant to digging, but it can also lead to turf burns, and if your Pokemon gnaws on it and starts to ingest some of it, it can lead to a Pokemon Center trip. Also, keep in mind that you could mix these different floors together to give your enclosure some variety. So maybe you want a deck near the entrance to the Pokemon house, and then grass near the door, making it so that the Pokemon is more likely to go to the bathroom there, and therefore making cleanup easier. Also, mixing together the different floor types will give a bit of enrichment to your Pokemon just through exploration. Speaking of enrichment, fox Pokemon like Vulpix do need a lot of things to keep them entertained. And if you don't entertain them enough, then they'll become a terror, digging way more, marking their territory where they shouldn't, and chewing up their Pokemon house. So, toys. They will be your best friend by entertaining your Pokemon and also giving you a way to interact and play with your Pokemon as well. Your whole goal with the toys should be variety and interactability. The best for you to get would be puzzle toys that reward treats when they get solved. As long as your Pokemon can figure them out, and most Pokemon are able to, then that'll keep their attention for quite a while. Other good toys are ones that you can hang from the ceiling, like tied-off tires or rattles. You should avoid giving them stuffed animals unless they're made to be durable. Giving them anything that's stuffed will only lead to them getting ripped open and the stuffing getting everywhere and swallowed. You should also get a water dish and a food dish, but make sure they're one of the heavy stone ones. That way your Pokemon doesn't use them as toys and destroys them. Believe me, it's a pain when your Pokemon destroys their food and water bowl, and you only find out as you're going to give them food or water. Booster. But yeah, in all, it's not that bad of an enclosure for you to have to put up. The biggest requirement is mostly space. As for Pokemon that can be housed with the Vulpix evolution, I would keep it away from small prey Pokemon. Things like small bug Pokemon, small flying type Pokemon, small grass type Pokemon, but really anything that's small enough that your Vulpix evolution could reliably hunt it and eat it should be kept away. So the obverse is also true. Large Pokemon could be fine alongside this Pokemon, so long as they don't have a territorial or aggressive temperament. Something like a Kangaskhan or maybe a Mudsdale. They tend to be pretty calm for most of the time. I know the only thing that freaks out Landslide, my Mudsdale, are plastic bags. I don't know why, but they just spook him for some reason. So large, calm Pokemon would be good. The best that you could have with your Vulpix line would be another canine line. Growlithe, Rockruff, Fido, all of those lines actually do well with the Vulpix line. They're very similar in temperament, and the younger of the Pokemon will actually adopt the habits of the older as they age together. It really does work out well. Just keep in mind that the enclosure size I gave you before was only designed to house one Pokemon. If you plan on keeping another Pokemon in that enclosure, you'll have to make it bigger to accommodate the other Pokemon's needs. Availability. Vulpix and Ninetales have a very weird availability. They do appear in the wild in almost every region, except for Kalos and Paldea, so you would think that it wouldn't be that bad to get your hands on one by catching it. But while they do appear in those regions, it's often only in specific places, like the exterior of Mount Pyre in Hoenn, the Abundant Shrine in Unova, or only Routes 7 and 8 in Kanto, which is its home region. You would think that a Pokemon line that's able to spread around the world like that would also be able to spread farther than just 1 or 2 spots per region. But my personal thoughts on it aside, if you do want to get a wild-caught Vulpix, then you could find one in your own region most likely, unless, of course, you live in the Kalos or the Paldea regions. Depending on where you live, however, it could be a bit of a journey until you get to the right place. And that's just Vulpix. Ninetales, since they're a stone evolution, don't happen in the wild that often. Some Vulpix go their entire lives and never evolve simply because they never come into contact with a Firestone. Also, I think I should mention this here, Ninetales as a species are very intelligent and can be very vengeful Pokemon. They are very willing to just attack people who anger them, and when they do, it isn't always with fire. While it's not a psychic type officially, Ninetales can learn a few psychic moves and it is more than willing to use those against people. That's why there are so many legends of how this Pokemon lays curses on people, and how its tails hold supernatural power. They don't, it's really just a combination of how this Pokemon acts, its defensiveness of its tails, and the misunderstanding of ancient peoples turned into legend. Long story short, if you're planning on trying to catch one of these Pokemon, go for a Vulpix. Not only is it more abundant in the wild, but they are also more forgiving and you can try and form a bond with it much, much easier than you ever could with the Ninetales. The breeder scene for these Pokemon is actually quite robust. Canine Pokemon are always a big hit, so they tend to be the Pokemon that a lot of breeders get into. So finding a breeder for your Vulpix won't be too hard. And getting a breeder-raised one will mean that it'll be friendlier towards you from the get-go, and act more like a family pet than a wild one would. I still recommend keeping it outside, as it will still mark its territory in your house, no matter how well trained it is. You could probably find someone willing to sell you a Ninetales as well, but that doesn't happen often, as the Firestones needed can get expensive, and buying a Ninetales doesn't mean it'll automatically trust you. In fact, with how intelligent these Pokemon are, they might just be more vindictive since you just took them from their home. So if you really want a Ninetales, I would recommend going the long way and getting a Vulpix from a breeder, building up your relationship with it, and then evolving it into a Ninetales yourself. Care. Care for your Vulpix line evolution is going to be equal parts food, maintenance, and play. Maintenance is exactly what it sounds like. It's the tasks that you have to do consistently to keep the enclosure and the Pokemon in good health. Cleaning the enclosure is going to be the number one thing that you'll have to do. This will include cleaning up the waste from your Pokemon, which involves a pooper scooper and a hose. It can also include having to replace any toys that have been destroyed or need to be changed out. But the biggest part of maintenance is going to be grooming. This isn't so much a need for Vulpix as it is for Ninetales, but it's still something that you'll need to do for both of these Pokemon. You should give your Vulpix a bath and brush them at minimum once a week, as those tails can get a lot of muck stuck in them. That should also go up in the molting season, which is going to happen if you live in a place that has warmer seasons. Ninetales, however, is where things may get a bit tricky. Ninetales has all the grooming requirements as Vulpix, but at a much more consistent rate of every other day. Thanks to Ninetales' longer fur and much longer tails, they'll almost constantly be needing brushing and bathing to stay clean. But that inlays the problem. Ninetales generally do not like their tails being touched, and will react aggressively to anyone touching it that they don't trust completely. Which can be a problem if you have a Ninetales that you haven't been able to form a bond with yet. This is one of the reasons that I don't recommend getting a Ninetales right away. To take care of it properly, you're going to need to groom them. But if you try to groom them, you're likely to get a flamethrower to the face. Luckily for those that insist on getting a Ninetales right away, there are grooming companies out there that can take care of this for you. The only reason that I didn't mention them before is because with a Pokemon like Ninetales, it can get pretty expensive. But if you're able to afford it, then that can save you a lot of headache and a lot of time. Since we've touched on how important a bond with these Pokemon is, let's talk about that next. Bonding with these Pokemon will be a big part of keeping them, as most fox-like Pokemon are very skittish around people. So it's going to take a lot of interaction and exposure to you and other people to get them to a point where they're comfortable around you. The best way to do this is to get a young Vulpix, one whose tails have just started to split. A young Vulpix is the best time to try and form a bond with them, as they're more receptive to you being there. It's at this point that you should be getting used to being near it and playing with it as well. Holding it, playing with it using the toys, and just hanging out with it in the enclosure will help that familiarity build. That's all the minimum that you should be doing, but there is more that you can do if you really want to. The Vulpix line are able to be collared and leash trained, allowing you to take them for walks around town. I highly recommend this, as it will not only greatly boost the rate at which your bond forms, but it will also get your Pokemon used to you and other people and Pokemon being around it. Just make sure you do this slowly. As I said, these Pokemon can be very skittish, so don't take them to places like downtown Castelia City right away. A few more details about the bonding/training. These Pokemon, while very similar to other dog Pokemon, are not dogs, and thus they don't take to training as well as most dog Pokemon do. You will have to be persistent and patient to be able to get through to them. Second, if you have a young Vulpix, they will go through a rebellious stage when they become a teenager, becoming a bit nippy and not listening to you very well, if at all. Again, just be patient and keep at it. Eventually, they'll move out of this rebellious stage, and then we'll go back to listening to you just fine. Now, all of this is if you get a young Vulpix. If it's an older one from the wild, or a Ninetales, then you're going to have to put a lot more effort into the training, and you may never be able to collar it and take it for a walk. The most you can probably hope for is a good relationship with them while they're in their enclosure. The last thing to go over in the care section is food. As I'm sure that many of you have guessed, meat is going to be a big part of these Pokemon's diet. But it won't be only meat, as these Pokemon are actually omnivores, so they eat berries and grains as well. After some research, I found what I consider to be a decent diet for these Pokemon. For Vulpix, you're going to start with 3 pounds of ground poultry for a base, either P-Dove or Pidgey. Then, on top of that, you're going to add 2 cups of hearty grains, 3 chopped hard-boiled eggs, which include the shells, and 2 cups of diced kelpsie, corn, and other berries. Really, you could add in any other berries that you want to, but avoid giving them grappa and tomato berries, as they can't digest them and it ends up not being good for their stomachs. For Ninetales, it will all be the same diet as Vulpix, but just in higher amounts. You'll instead need 4.5 pounds of meat, 3 1/3 cups of hearty grains, 5 chopped hard-boiled eggs, and 3 1/3 cups of the diced berries. Once you have all the ingredients, roll and mix them all together thoroughly and divide them into 16 equal portions. Wrap those tightly in saran wrap to keep them good, and then place them in the freezer for later days. Each of these portions that you've made is going to be one meal. There will be 2 feedings a day, one in the morning and one at night. So when feeding time comes, take a serving out to thaw. Then place the thawed food into a bowl in the enclosure, and that should be good for your Pokemon. One thing to keep in mind when it comes to feeding your Vulpix Pokemon is that these Pokemon and other fox Pokemon like to hide food away if they get full without eating all of it. In nature, this is to ensure that they have a steady amount of food when they can't hunt for it. But in their enclosure, you're going to be bringing them food on a regular basis, so that means that the food they stash will just rot and become a health hazard. If they do start to do this, move the bowl closer to the doorway of the enclosure and close off the Pokemon's house during feeding time, which is the most likely spot that they're going to be putting the extra food. This should help to discourage them from doing that and just eating all the food they have. Cost. The cost of the actual Pokemon can fluctuate wildly, depending on how you get it and where you're getting it from. Going out and catching a wild one might be your cheapest option if you live near an area where wild Vulpix and Ninetales appear. But if you have to travel, then that price could easily go up thanks to travel costs. And then you'll need to invest a lot of time into the training and bonding with the Pokemon, which will be even harder because it's from the wild and more inclined to mistrust you. Getting one from a breeder will somewhat remove this time need, but it means that you'll be paying for that pleasure, which is going to make the price soar upwards. And then, if you plan on getting a Ninetales, you'll be paying even more on top of that, as the price of the Firestone will be added to the price of the Pokemon. In all, you could be looking at anywhere from the moderate category to very deep in the very high category. There just isn't a way around that. The enclosure is going to be in the very high category as well. Needing everything for the fencing, the equipment to dig and set it up correctly, and all the little toys and additions you'll be adding into it, and it's going to run you into the very high category. You could also skip the hassle of putting it up yourself and hire a company to come in and do it for you. That will be more expensive than doing it yourself, but it will save you time and make sure that the enclosure is built to code and to standard. After all, not all of us, myself included, are handy enough to build one of these enclosures on our own. Either way, you'll be spending on different ends of the very high category, depending on which route you decide to go on. The last thing that you'll be needing to spend a significant amount of money on will be the food. The diet that I gave you earlier is enough to feed your Pokemon for roughly 8 days, so you'll need to make more almost every week. As always, buying in bulk can sort of lessen this cost, but there's no way to avoid being in the high category for your food. Most of that is going to be the meat, as the rest of it you can get cheaply in quantities that'll last you multiple weeks. In all, these Pokemon will be very expensive to get and house. Conclusion. I started this care guide talking about how many different kinds of canine Pokemon there are, and how they, more often than not, make exceptionally great family Pokemon. But after going through the guide, I have to say that while they do still fit that description, the Vulpix line is towards the bottom of that list. The positives are that they are both beautiful creatures, especially Ninetales with its golden fur. And when they fully bond with someone, they are very loving and caring Pokemon. They absolutely can make good pets, especially Vulpix. But they do have plenty of downsides. They aren't as sociable as the other dog Pokemon and can easily have an attitude that should only be paired with strong-willed trainers. Combine that with the high cost to keep and the large time investment in taking care of one of these Pokemon, and this is really a Pokemon species that's best for experienced owners who have cut their teeth on caring for other Pokemon. Now, if that's you, then these may just be the perfect Pokemon partners for you, but please consider that when you are looking into getting one. Thank you all for listening, and please join us next time when we go over the balloon Pokemon Jigglypuff and the others in its line. Thank you, and have a wonderful night, everyone.